Grace and peace to each of you from God our Father. I'm going to make an assumption today that many of you have heard. Don't pay attention to Malcolm, pay attention to me. That many of you have heard the story we're going to cover today. How many of you have heard about the story of David and Goliath? And the hands shoot up. My assumption was correct. So let's jump straight into it in order to refresh our memories. Everybody turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. I will be reading out of the New King James Version. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines drew on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of his coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old and advanced in years and in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Adonijah, and the 3rd son Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son David, Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse has commanded him. And he went up to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in a battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hands of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was a champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, What shall be done for this man who kills a Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, So shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, the oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, Why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and these people answered him as the first ones did. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to the armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Then David spoke to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell among the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." So the king said, "Inquire whose son this young man is." Then, as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" So David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." Wow, it's a long story. I hope that all of you have heard this many times, and I won't be going over the complete text, but we'll be covering some of the main points. So let's pray today. Father, I come to you today. I am trembling before you, trembling before your word. Father, please let me not dirty your word. Please let us not say anything here today that goes against you, that is not truth. My Lord, I pray that after today, after studying your word, that we would feel more prepared to stand up and defend you and our lives, no matter the cost. And in your Son's name we pray. Amen. So a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking about this story, and I realized that almost every person here has some lesson about David and Goliath. So I sent out a survey to our church, and there was a little survey, and it said, help Zach prepare a message. And it asked, what is one lesson that stands out to you from the story of David and Goliath in one or two sentences? Do you guys want to hear what people said back? Yeah, I'll read through some of them. All right, so this is what our church is saying from this story, so we get a little feel for what people are thinking about after they read through that. So, confidence that when you do the will of God and defend the honor of his name, he will fight for you and with you. It was the beginning of David's role as a prophet. He predicts the Lord delivering Goliath into his hand, and this will provide witness that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. Jesse didn't protect David by the world by keeping him from it. He protected him from the world by equipping him to face it and to conquer it. David seems like he was pretty young when he was out on his own with the sheep in the field. Jesse gave him the tools he needed and the space and the exposure to prove those tools. Saul wanted to give him the best defense with no training and send him headlong towards the enemy. Don't be proud. The giants that we battle in this life are no match for us when we fight on the Lord's side. David had a completely different perspective than the rest of Israel. He saw God's dishonor by Goliath and operated in faith based on God's power. It's a story of perspective and operating in faith. God is mighty. It's when he works through us in faith that we can do great things. David did not trust in his physically fit body to overcome Goliath. Neither was he trying to look good in the eyes of man. His older brother seemed to have that perception. David's words, "Is there not a cause?" revealed that he was genuinely concerned about the glory of God. Something very small can destroy something filled with pride. David did not originally go out to his brothers to fight, but when the time came, he was ready. He didn't want the king's extra armor. He was just ready to do whatever needed. God was on his side, and that was all he needed. Oops, 3 sentences, now 4 emoji. Facing your giants head on. David ran to meet Goliath. He didn't stand and wait for Goliath. David is the picture of preparation, past life experiences, rejection of unproven tactics, 5 stones. Dude is ready. It seems that the one thing that really stands out is David's courage and faith in God and how God honors that. An interesting question that I've never quite resolved is how David got all of Israel to bet their lives on his match with Goliath. His unwavering confidence in God, from the time he stepped into camp to the time he stood before the king having slain Goliath. David has strong faith in God. It is the God consciousness of David. He is tremendously God conscious in this story. David's supreme God consciousness is something that really, really stands out in this story. All right, so as you have heard, all of us have lessons that we've learned from this iconic story. So I want to take a moment and look at some of the dominant themes about what this story is and what this story is not. But first, I want to do a little exercise together. Brother Malcolm, I am going to need your assistance, and I'm going to need 2 more volunteers as well. If you could come up here with me. Let me look out at our audience and pick some volunteers. Josh, could I pick you? Just come and stand in this corner. And Luke, can I pick you? Luke and Josh. All right, great. So I'm gonna demonstrate a position for Josh and Luke, and it's called the hand link position with our elbows on the table. So, Brother Malcolm. So assume this is the hand link, and then this is the position. Got it? Got it? All right. Thanks, Brother Malcolm. You're done. Yeah, you can sit down. All right. So please assume this position. Hands linked. Hands linked. Yeah. So does it look good? Hands linked, elbows locked. All right. Don't do anything yet. Brother Malcolm, can you get a timer too? I'm going to need a 10-second timer. All right. This is a very easy exercise. There are only 2 things you must know. You get a point if the back of your partner's hand touches the table. That's the first thing you have to know. Second, you want to get as many points for yourself as possible. You don't care about anybody else. Those are the 2 things you need to know. All right. Our Brother Malcolm, you're going to have 10 seconds, and on Brother Malcolm's go, you're going to say go. Okay. In 10 seconds, Brother Malcolm. And members from the audience, please keep count of... All right. Brother Finney, can you keep count of the back of Josh's hand? And Austin, can you keep count of the back of Luke's hand? Ready? All right.
3, 2, 1, go.
Any hand. It doesn't matter which hand.
There are only 2 things you need to know.
I see.
Time.
Time. Okay. Thank you. Can I have a round of applause for our audience? Thank you. Yeah, you can put that away. I know you're all dying to see what this is about. All right. What was the count, Brother Finney?
It was hard for me to tell on the bottom hand.
It was the back of the opponent's hand. It had to hit the back. I counted 0 on each.
Yeah, I didn't see any either. I think Josh got 1.
Josh got 1? All right, so the end game was 1-0. All right. Let's explain what just happened. Brother Malcolm, I actually need you one more time, and I'm gonna demonstrate for you. Can we set this back up? Sorry, no. Just 2. I'm going to demonstrate for you a different perspective. All right, we're going to repeat the game now, but Brother Malcolm and I are going to have a different perspective. I want you to listen to me carefully. Malcolm, the rules of the game are that the back of our hands have to just touch the back. So why don't you just tap your hand repeatedly, I'll tap my hand repeatedly, and then we each get a bunch of points. Okay. Nobody said we're arm wrestling.
It's true.
Okay.
That's a very good point.
3, 2, 1, go. I say we each got 20 or 30 points, right? Okay, good. All right, thank you. Another interesting perspective to exactly the same game. So what happened there? Let's think about this. Let's think about this and ask some questions and some debriefs. Obviously, after the first iteration, what could have the first set of partners done differently? Josh, what could you have done differently with Luke?
I guess we could have just shared the points both and going out like you guys did.
Okay, could have shared the points. What else could have happened?
Is it necessary that they did the linked arm position?
I didn't say keep it.
You just that was just like an influence, but it wasn't necessary.
I said assume this position. I didn't say you had to keep the position. All right. What assumptions did the first team make that limited their success? It was a competition. They also assumed they were arm wrestling. Did I say they were arm wrestling? I never said they were arm wrestling, but they assumed that they were. That's another assumption that drastically shaped their perspective. And I'm going to ask this too. Did the audience make any assumptions about the game that I set up? What assumptions did somebody make? Austin?
Same, that they were arm wrestling.
That they were arm wrestling? Brevin, did you assume they were arm wrestling? I also tried to set it up that One of them appeared to be Goliath. One of them appeared to be David. Given that it's the story of David and Goliath, I was hoping that the audience was thinking I was going to go down that track. You probably assumed this. I never said it, but you're operating under these perspectives that drastically affect the outcome of the game. Oftentimes in life, it's hard to overstate this, that it is difficult for us to dismantle the assumptions we hold and develop a collaborative approach when we folks assume that it's always better for one person to have more points than the other person. I never said that either. We automatically assume that, oh, I must be in competition with my opponent. I need to get more points than him. One of the key points in the story of David and Goliath, and it's difficult to overstate this, our assumptions affect the way we operate in the world. Some are true, but incorrect assumptions can be devastating. Incorrect assumptions can be devastating. Classically, this arm wrestling example is used in the field of negotiations. It's actually one of the first modules that any negotiator will go through in order to train how to be a mediator. One of the things that people automatically assume is a zero-sum world. So what is a zero-sum world? It's also called a fixed pie world. A fixed pie world is where there's a fixed amount of pie, and that you can have some pie, Josh can have some pie, and Luke can have some pie. The opposite of a zero-sum world is that you can actually create more value by communicating with each other, by working with each other. The second thing is that often we enter negotiations and we misplace, we make adversaries that don't exist. We approach negotiations as adversaries. Third, we restrict communications. It's another thing that comes out of this. We need to talk to each other more. And fourth, we limit our own abilities to find optimal solutions when we operate under assumptions. All right, I want to drive this point even further about how assumptions can change our perception and change the way we operate. I'll give a silly example, and I'll give a more serious example. I was at a dinner table the other week, and we were talking about bathing habits. And the topic came up, we started talking about washcloths. And we took a poll of hands, and we said, who uses a washcloth when they're in the shower? And I was in the vast minority of people who don't use washcloths. People looked at me, they're like, that's kind of gross. Like, how do you wash yourself? And I said, yeah, I get washcloths. I've never used them. My family never grew up using them. But I just think it's gross that you guys use a washcloth, sits there, it gets wet, and then you use it over and over and over again and without washing it. And they looked at me and they're like, do you think we're savages? We wash our washcloths every time after we use it. And I looked at them and said, really? I never knew that. I thought you people were gross. It smells bad. I would never touch my body with that washcloth. An example of a silly assumption. The other one, we were talking about toothbrushes. How many of you here think it's kind of gross to use somebody else's toothbrush? Yeah, everybody in here. I would make the same case, but we were sitting there trying to debate, and they were saying, hey, what if we washed the toothbrush, and then it's basically clean and new, and I couldn't even hold it in my mind, but they had a good argument, because they said, would you rather use a used washcloth or use toothbrush? I think toothbrush is better. All right. And then, lastly, there's a great documentary. It's called Beyond the Gates of Splendor. It's about the story of Nate Sate and Jim Elliott. And they bring up one of the members of the Waodani tribe, and he shares his experience with his first time coming to the U.S. and bathing in a shower for the first time. And he comically describes his plight to operate the American showers, which sometimes can double as spaceships. I know that all of us have had this experience where you look at a shower and you don't know how to get it to come on. And Nate Saint tells the story. He had to come in and he was underneath the spigot on the bottom bathing, trying to bathe underneath the spigot. He says, I don't know how you people do this. He didn't know that there's a button that it made it come out of the top spigot. And then in Mozambique, I'll never forget this. Has anyone ever bucket bathed without a stream of flowing water? This isn't an intuitive approach. The first time I ever bucket bathed, I thought I had to pour the water slowly over myself, and I had a limited amount, and this guy was like, no, let me teach you, and he taught me how to bucket bathe. So our assumptions drive the way that we operate in the world. Our assumptions drive the way we operate in our world, and we have to fight to hold the right perspectives on how to operate and how to operate in faith. A more serious example of this assumption are health symptoms. How many of us have ever heard somebody, I'm sure the medical people in the room can say that you hear about somebody having a slight example of a health symptom, they're losing energy, they can't eat, and sometimes they assume it's probably nothing big. It's probably nothing big. In my life, this was classically, my mom had pancreatic cancer, and she was tired, she had trouble eating, and our assumption was, oh, it's probably nothing big, you probably are just having some trouble digesting. It was pancreatic cancer on the inside, eating her away. And it's the plight of some of these more severe cancers, and if we would have acted sooner, we would have had different outcomes. So after trying to convince you that our assumptions drive our perceptions and change outcomes, what assumptions do you think you have that might limit your success or change your perception of God? What assumptions do you have that might limit your success or your perception of God? If we try to test our assumptions today, we can discern which ones to keep, which assumptions we should hold on to that help us, and which ones we should toss in order to operate in faith. All right. So let's get into the story. There are so many takes on the story of David and Goliath. It's a little bit daunting to know how to start. Has anyone here heard of Malcolm Gladwell? Not Malcolm White. So Malcolm Gladwell, he's a famous author, and he puts a spin on David and Goliath. He reads the story and he says, actually, the odds were all in David's favor. Like any reader of this text would have realized that Goliath is this big buffoon, has a medical disease, he's stumbling, he has double vision, he's slow, he can't see, he sees David with 2 sticks. Goliath was this big buffoon. So this story is actually completely flipped. That's one way of looking at the story. There's another book, another teaching on it. Has anyone here heard of Louis Giglio? Louis Giglio wrote a book called Goliath Must Fall, Winning the Battle Against Your Goliaths. And here's the premise to the book. Many of us have giants in our lives, hang-ups and habits, fears and insecurities that keeping us from reaching our full potential. Frozen, we lose sight of the promise God has for our lives and settle for far less than best. But there's a better way forward. In Goliath Must Fall, Louis Giglio offers powerful insights from the biblical story of David that will help you overcome your giants once and for all by fixing your eyes on the size of your God and not the size of your giants. However, I'm going to try to push back on both of those perspectives. The driving force behind the story of David and Goliath and not in any of the Flanagan Graph demonstration is not about being courageous in the facing your giants, the bully down the street, all your fears, woes, worries, poor self-image. The force is in how we react to the defiance of God. That those are the giants. It's not about us and our problems. It's about our perception of God and how we react. There are also a lot of questions that go unanswered in this test. Number 1, why on earth did Israel let David, a shepherd, fight when so much was at stake? Why didn't Saul recognize David when he was already playing a harp for him in the last chapter? But rather than focus on the unanswered questions today, we're going to be paying attention to what is written. All right, so the key word in this story is the word defy. Defy. It's mentioned 6 times in this text. Defy, other words for defy are reproach, mock, derive, and it's from the root word. Where's our Hebrew? Can I lock eyes with our Hebrew expert? Oh, he's not in here. It's from the root word harap. I don't know if you've learned, our Hebrew speakers have learned that yet, but it appears 6 times. In verse 10, 25, twice in verse 26, verse 36, and verse 45. The word defy obviously comes from Goliath and his attitude toward Israel and God. So I don't know how many times you've heard this story talked about facing our own personal giants, but I want you to let that go. Just let that image go and try to overcome that. It's more about faithfully challenging dishonor to God. David is the perfect picture of preparation for operating in faith. All right, so what I want to do is I want to walk through this story and look at 6 different characters. 6 different characters. How many of you have ever taken a personality test? For some reason, personality tests, we like them because we can relate to people and we can sort of try to put ourselves in their shoes. It's easier to look at people's attributes and stories and try to relate to them. When I was first starting to think about marketing for Sattler College, I was on the phone with somebody who spends a lot of time marketing on Facebook, and he said, "Oh, do you know what you should do?" And I said, "What?" He said, "You should write a quiz that people can take, and they say, which Christian college best fits your personality?" And you'll get so many clicks, and you'll get so many leads that generate through it. And, we wrote this quiz, and you obviously force people to try to go into some bucket or not. So we're going to try to do this with some of the different characters in this story, and hopefully we can relate to each of them. So for each character, I want us to look at what assumptions did the character have? How did it affect the way they operate in this story? And the third question is, what was the result? So assumptions, how did it affect the way they operate, and what were the results? I'll also try to draw on some outside examples outside of the text. So before we start looking at these 6 characters, I've already named the six personalities, and I'm going to try to have you guess which character it is. So the first character is the God Defier. The God Defier. Who am I talking about? Oh, Goliath. Good. This is going well. All right. The second character that we're going to talk about is the fearful bystander. This character is represented more as a group in this story. The fearful bystanders. Okay, I'm going to go with Israel. The faithful bystanders. Israel in general. This is the second character. Let's look at the third character, the entitled naysayer. Who would be the entitled? Who was it? Eliab. All right, David's older brother. The entitled naysayer. And this is another character, the willing enabler. The willing enabler. I'm not who? Jesse. Okay, I'm going to go with Jesse. The willing enabler. And number 5, the realistic free rider. The realistic free rider.
Saul.
Yes, Saul. Okay, the realistic free rider, Saul. And then last of all, the God-conscious challenger. David. All right, so we're going to walk through these 6 personalities that I've just named, and we're going to look at the assumptions they make, and we're going to look at how it affects the way they operate and the results. All right, so let's start with Goliath, the God Defier. What assumptions did Goliath make in this story? I'm going to try to have some dialogue. What assumptions did he make?
David couldn't kill him.
David couldn't kill him.
Probably that nobody could kill him.
Nobody could kill him.
That is a close-range battle.
Close range battle.
Bigger is better.
Bigger is better. Muscles, brawn over intelligence. So in verse 10, if we want to, you don't have to follow along. I just want to make sure to stick as close to the text as possible here. So in verse 10, we see Goliath. The Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard the word of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So I think the two of the biggest assumptions that Goliath makes is, you can defy the God of Israel and live. That's obviously a big assumption that he's making. You can defy the God of Israel and live. Another assumption he makes, some of you got at it, relying on physical strength and worldly success will prosper you forever. Will prosper you forever. The key word there is forever. A lot of times I think we're in danger of saying to the world, like, hey, don't rely on your own strength. But in reality, it kind of has gotten them to where they are today. Goliath was big and bad. If we read his description, man, the spear he was holding probably weighed as much as me. His shield was big. He had gotten to where he was, and he was prospering. By all accounts, he was prospering, but not forever. Those who defy the living God will not prosper forever. So how does it affect the way he operates? How do these assumptions affect the way he operates?
He's arrogant.
Arrogant. I would say he's pretty arrogant. He's confident. He's arrogant. He's confident. Anything else that anyone would add on?
Fearless.
Fearless.
He's proactive. He moves first.
He moves first. He's the one that actually challenges Israel and moves forward. He's fearless. And he's also, I would say, he has risen above his fellow, the rest of the Philistines beside him. So he has risen as a leader. He's a champion by all means. All right, but let's look at the results. So what are the outcomes of the assumptions that Goliath has? The God defiers. Gets his head chopped off. The result is as straightforward as that. Everything wasn't prepared for the stone. Was definitely not prepared for the stone. Shamed. Goliath is shamed. Goliath stands in condemnation before the living God.
He got all his brothers and family and nation enslaved.
Yes. So the Philistines run away. This little battle that they play, he ends up losing. The God defiers have their head cut off in the end. All right. So let's look at Israel, the fearful bystander. What assumptions do Saul and Israel make that shape their perspective of the situation? It's a lot of it is framed in verse 11. I'll read two different verses. So when Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And then next, so verse 25, they say, so the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king, will enrich with great riches, and will give him his daughter and give him his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. So what assumptions are Israel in general making here?
Goliath is unbeatable.
Goliath is unbeatable.
That they will lose.
That they will lose. That they have no match to Goliath. What else are they assuming?
But this is the only option.
This is the only option. They've already been set by Goliath's game. Goliath names the terms, and they lock into it. They lock into the elbows down, hands linked position. They lock into Goliath's terms without communicating. I think another more obvious assumption is that they're afraid of worldly success and strength. They view that as something to be feared. So what is it? How does it affect the way they operate? Or the result here? They're frozen. They retreat. They become what I like to call bystanders. Who knows what a bystander is?
Somebody who stands by.
And does nothing. Somebody who watches and does nothing as the world before them burns away. This is the effect of holding these assumptions. We become bystanders. We become fearful bystanders. And the result is that they're quivering in the camp waiting for a hero. They quiver in a camp waiting for a hero. So in today's world, I would argue that we are in a plight of quivering in our camps waiting for a hero. Some people have picked up on this in different aspects of the world. Two areas I'd like to point to. So airport security. After 9/11, there were a lot of reports of different people and incidences in airport security. So they actually started a campaign, the federal government. It was called the See Something, Say Something campaign. And people were trying to crowdsource people and say, hey, rather than rely on a small number of resources, if you see something, say something. That has become the large operating mode to increase airport security and not to become bystanders. At the college I went to, that we faced, before I went there, we faced a huge plight of sexual assault. There were sexual assault cases were rising drastically in the college scene, and so all of a sudden they had to have something called bystander trading. They said, hey, if you see a predator about to lure somebody into a situation, you have to step up, you have to intervene. And so this is a call to not be a bystander. We, under the wrong assumptions, in that we can't stand up and challenge the God defiers, we'll sit in our camps and do nothing. All right, let's move on to the next character, Eliab, the entitled naysayer. So what assumptions does Eliab make in verse 28 to 30? I'll read it right now. So now Eliab, his older brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. What assumptions is David's older brother making?
That David is proud.
David is proud.
He's come down to see the battle.
He's come down to see the battle.
He assumes there's safety in numbers.
Safety in numbers. So he's the one staying with his camp.
He sees this potential success for Israel as Israel fighting as a whole and avoiding individual combat.
Exactly.
Individual combat is bound to lose.
It's kind of like he's saying that David is weak.
David's weak. That there's actually merit to the firstborn order, that how dare David come and say something as opposed to him being a younger brother.
That David's irresponsible.
David's irresponsible. There's pride in his heart. Left the sheep. Good. These are all really good. The result, so Eliab tears down a godly man, and he weaponizes his intentions. He puts intentions in David's heart that didn't belong there. And I also think that one of the more important results of this story that we learn is when we look at the end of the story, whose name is shockingly absent? Eliab, yeah. Which I think is really interesting. Naysayers rarely show up in victory. The absence of Eliab's name at the end of the story is significant because David's the one who steps up, and he's the one that gets involved and starts defying all these things in this. So what's an alternative to being a naysayer? What's an alternative to being a naysayer? There's a story in Acts 5 about the apostles being confronted before the Pharisees, and all the Pharisees are looking at them and they're saying, look what they're doing. Throw them in prison. Capture them. But there's a man named Gamaliel, and he steps up and he says, hey, I have an idea. Rather than attack these men, why don't we wait and see what the result is? If it's a godly endeavor, it will succeed. If it is not a godly endeavor, it will fail. There are a lot of alternatives to being naysayers in this world that we can actually test. And all too often, people draw on the past and their assumptions in order to try to step into a situation which they rarely understand. David's older brother here, I would say, is a classic example of a naysayer who's entitled because of his birthright. All right, so let's look at the next character in verse 17, Jesse the willing enabler. Jesse the willing enabler. So then Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and of these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them." So there was a comment among the brothers that I loved. I'll read it again. "Jesse didn't protect David from the world by keeping him from it. He protected him from the world by equipping him to face it and conquer it. David seems like he was pretty young when he went out on his own with the sheep in the field. Jesse gave him the tools he needed and the space and exposure to prove these tools." So what assumptions was Jesse making in his fatherhood and being a father?
That David was responsible enough to do this.
He was responsible enough to do this. Any other assumptions that Jesse as a father makes with his sons?
He was capable or had the potential to do.
Yeah. And then
He believed Samuel's anointing amounted to something.
Samuel's anointing amounted to something. Jesse had still thought back to Samuel's anointing of David previously in the book.
He sends him to see the captain, which says something about his idea of leadership.
He sends him to see the captain. Yeah. And also, David, there's obviously something here that David's a youth. The word youth is mentioned various times. But I have heard this story taught that your youth shouldn't disqualify you from responsibility and important tasks. I would say that Jesse sort of gets this. He gets that we don't need to bubble in the people in order to teach them lessons. It's actually the opposite, where Jesse made the assumption that if he gave David enough rope, that he would run with it. And what is the result? Any other results in David? The result is his son becomes a faithful challenger, but the other result is his other son becomes a naysayer. So I think that in Jesse we see a sort of a juxtaposition of fatherhood, and that we need to trust the process rather than the outcome. So sometimes we have to give the people we're teaching enough freedom, enough room, enough space to be enabled to experiment, or not to experiment, but to train and to be trained by the world. But sort of the tragedy is that sometimes the results aren't always going to be the same. Our families here at Followers of the Way, all of us are huge advocates of homeschooling. There's a book that I haven't completely read through. It's called The Self-Propelled Advantage, about how homeschooling actually gives children enough room to take their education into their own hands. And it seems like Jesse had enough trust in David to give him one of the best homeschooling educations the world has ever seen. I wish I had bears and lions to train as my homeschooling education. Maybe we should look into that as a church. I'm just saying. All right, so I have an example that I want to draw on from this. So how many of you remember learning how to drive? Yeah, learning how to drive. It's quite an interesting thought process. So I have two stories. So the first, my older sister, her name was Whitney. My dad was classically a man like Jesse. He wouldn't sit by us. He would just give us so much freedom. So he took Whitney out, and we were teaching her how to drive, and I was in the back seat, and he drove us to this hill near my house, and he parked the car. It was about half a mile away. It wasn't a stick shift, it was an automatic. And he got out and he said, "Whitney, it's your responsibility to get this car to our house." And then he gets out and walks away. That's just who my dad was. Who my dad was as a person. And I'm sitting there in the van with Whitney, and we're like, "Oh, this is awesome. Like, look how much Dad trusts us." And my sister she was sitting in the intersection, and she pulled out, and there was a little shifter the shifter was on the right side of the steering wheel. I don't know what those are called. You know what I'm talking about. And she was trying to get it into drive, and she couldn't do it. She started getting nervous, and then a car started piling up. And all of a sudden, I'll never forget this. I was in the car, and I watched her put it in drive and just step on the pedal, and we went right into the wall in front of us. Straight into the wall. The door dented. She couldn't get out. We had to call my dad, and we were like, Dad, Whitney crashed the car. And he comes running back, oh, that's enough rope to hang yourself, apparently. But then later, I was learning to drive my senior year. Whitney had already crashed the car. This is a different car, and this time it's a stick shift. And my dad's trying to teach me how to park on a hill. Has anyone who here drives stick shift? How easy is it to get going in a stick shift off a hill your first time? Yeah, terrifying. So my dad drives to the exact same spot on the exact same hill. He parks the car, cranks the e-brake, and says, "Zach, I'll see you at home. Your job is to get this car back home." And I'm sitting there, and I couldn't do it. You got to get the right mix of clutch and pedal, and I couldn't do it. I was so scared. And I was in the car when Whitney crashed, and all these memories started flashing back into my mind, and I'm like, I can't do this. But me being as astute as I am, I rolled the car all the way down the hill backwards, and I got it started, drove home, made it safely. Here we go. So this is a lesson we learn from preparation in the form of Jesse. Sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's not, but sometimes I think it's worth the risk. Preparation is what drives David. David was prepared. Many people think he was an underdog, but I would argue the opposite. So Jesse, the willing enabler, we need to learn from him as we try to prepare the next generation. All right, and the next character I want to look at is Saul, the realistic free rider. All right, let's look at verses 33 really quick. So Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth." And then later on, I'm going to skip a little bit. In verse 38, after Saul's agreed for David to fight, Saul clothes David with his armor, and he puts a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothes him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I had not tested them." So David took them off. So what assumptions does Saul make as king here?
Armor is needed.
Armor is needed.
David can use the armor well.
David can use the armor well. Any other assumption?
David's life is expendable.
That's exactly what David's life is expendable. I think the exact same thing. I think when Saul says in verse 37, and Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." I think that's fake. I think Saul's thinking, let's just get this over with. Let's have someone killed. It probably won't make a big difference in the end. Any other assumptions that Saul makes?
It was going to be a traditional fight.
Traditional fight. Locking into the terms that Goliath had set. I would say this youth, there's something about this youth. He says to David, you're a youth. He is a man of war. His experience is going to match your experience in battle. He doesn't think that David's previous experience is going to carry over after David says to him, "I've killed a lion. I've killed a bear. I've delivered things from the flock." And he says, not even that. God has rescued me in this. Any other assumptions beyond that?
David is strong enough to carry the armor.
Strong enough to carry the armor. Exactly. And the word realistic, I use the word realistic. Saul just assumes, carry on with the way we've always done things, and it'll be okay. He's not trying to break out. He's not trying to present any new ideas. He is the one. He arms him. And what is the result? I think someone said it well in our survey. Saul wanted to give David the best defenses, but he gives him no training, and he sends him headlong towards the enemy. And I think with the intent, I think that Saul was going to say he's going to die. There's no chance he's going to make it. So can anyone come up with another example of, I'm gonna call it free riding in the Bible. So free riding is a concept where you get to benefit from other people's success without putting in the work for yourself. You get to benefit from other people's success without putting in the work for yourself. I think at the outcome of this, when David, David brings the head of Goliath to Saul, and he says, here's his head. You have victory over the Philistines. Saul did absolutely nothing, but he gets to benefit from the success. What are another example of free riding in the Bible? Can anyone come up with some good ones? Where somebody benefits from somebody else's efforts without putting in the effort.
David later in his life.
David later in his life. Can you?
I believe there's a prophet that comes to David later in his life and says, "Why are you resting here at home when your forces are out fighting the enemy?"
Yep, he does. I would make the case this is maybe more of a stretch, but the story of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts, there's been many people who talk about that, but everybody was selling everything they had, and Ananias and Sapphira said, oh, we can kind of ride on these benefits without selling everything we have and still get everything for ourselves. So Saul becomes a free rider. When you make the assumption that you don't have to rely on God as your provision, you end up riding on other people who figure it out for themselves. And then in terms of this preparation question, Brother Malcolm and I were walking down the street the other day, and we were talking about preparation. We were talking about this word preparation, and we were talking about strategies that we've used in order to prepare for the academic tests in our life. And how many of you before a test have sort of stopped studying and just turned to a quick solution in order to try to benefit you for that test? Has anybody ever done that before? Nobody? I've done it. So in the past, I get tired of studying, and I lay down my books and I say, I'm just going to go and eat something. I'm going to eat some yogurt. Maybe that will help me on my test tomorrow. Or I'm going to pray in the morning really hard. I'm going to pray really hard in the morning, and maybe God will give me favor. Maybe he'll put the answers right in my brain. Malcolm and I were talking about in the college I went to, there was this pill that went around, and the pill, you were supposed to take the pill, and it would give you it would help you concentrate a lot. And we were talking about some people have taken that pill without studying, and they soon discover, no, the pill is supposed to help you study, not help you take the test. So Saul sort of makes the same error. He gives David his armor, tries to equip him, but without the adequate preparation. All right, let's move on to David. What assumptions does David, the God-conscious challenger, make in this story? So let's turn to verse 26. I'll point something interesting out about verse 26. Although David has been with us for a little bit in our story, this is the first time that David ever actually speaks in the Bible, or the first time that his voice is recorded. So verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?"
He thinks that he's unbeatable.
That who's unbeatable?
Or not that he's unbeatable, he can beat him.
That David can beat him. Why does he think that?
That God's on his side.
Yeah, because God's being defied. David pulls into this and he says, why are you letting this Philistine gallivant around you, parading his little speech when he's defying God? So one of the first assumptions that David makes is he views Israel and God as basically synonymous. He views God's people and God as basically synonymous. He says, okay, there's this enemy, he's standing before you, he's defying you, but this is essentially defying God. So God makes Israel and David basically synonymous. And then let's turn to verses 34 and 35 here. Actually, I'm just going to read this whole paragraph. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and the uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. seeing he defies the armies of the living God. Moreover, David says, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. So what assumption or what perspective does David have here that's unique?
He assumes that God will not, short the right words, but tolerate this defamation of his name.
Yeah, so God's not going to stand for this. I would point out here that when looking back at your stories, some of us have interesting stories in our life, and I think I slip into this. I attribute my success in my previous stories to myself. You look at this, I killed a lion, I killed a bear, but David attributes, or he assumes, that his enemy defeating stories are due to God rather than himself. Did you catch that? So David, he's killed lions, he's killed bears, but he says, God rescued me from these. It was nothing to do with my own strength. And interestingly, a lot of people paint this story as the underdog. So a lot of people say David's the underdog, David's not. Do you think David assumes he's an underdog? David doesn't assume he's an underdog here. You look at that. Do you see what he's saying in front of Saul? He's saying, you think this guy's anything compared to what I've dealt with? I bet you David's saying like lions, bears, or Goliath. Which would you rather face? I think I'd rather face a human. So he doesn't assume that he's an underdog. And he attributes the defeating of a bear and a lion not to his own strength, but to God rescuing him. All right. I'm just going to point this out again because this is somewhat ridiculous. Who here has ever been trained what to do if you encounter a bear in the forest? Bryant, what do you do?
Typically, you make yourself big and back away slowly.
Make yourself big and back away. Okay. Any other?
If it sees you.
If it sees you?
Don't run.
Don't run. Okay. I've heard run or run as fast or just stand still and make yourself big. Any
I've
other?
heard you're supposed to alert them to your presence to say, "Whoa, bear!" So just so they know that you're there.
So to tell the bear that you're there. What is David's posture towards bears? Man, he's basically saying, a bear comes for me, I'm gonna kill it. How many of us could give the same advice? Yeah, very few of us. So here, just like in this perspective here, David is so incredibly God conscious. He knows that he's so tethered to God that he's pompous enough to assume that when a bear comes after him, he's going to kill it. And he says this to Saul, God will rescue me, and it's not his own strength. I think this is amazing. David doesn't assume he's an underdog, because who can assume they're an underdog when you have God backing you? It's probably a cliche point, but it's true more than ever in this story. All right, and then let's look at verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts and the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. What assumption is David making here in this verse? Somebody actually mentioned this in the very beginning of the story, that Goliath fails to see what battle he's in, where he has a sword and David has a slingshot. So a lot of people, Malcolm Gladwell being one, he says, David's actually the one that is in the superior strength. He's like, has a gun, David doesn't have a gun. So what assumption does David make here? I would say that he assumes no matter what weapon he had, it wouldn't matter because he's confronting the enemy with God, not the weapon. Does he point to his slingshot? Does David point to his slingshot? Does he say that? Let's read it again. You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and the javelin, but I come to you with a slingshot. No, David doesn't say that. You get it? It doesn't matter what we're equipped with here on earth as long as we have God. We can have ranged weapons. They could have melee weapons. He says, I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you had defied. Therefore, David doesn't assume whatever earthly mechanism he has is going to give him the victory. he relies back on God as his strength and the one who rescues him. Another very salient point about David. All right, let's read. I'm actually going backwards. Sorry, I skipped. So let's read verses 38 through 39. As Saul proposes the armor to David, what is David's reaction to this armor? Does David off the bat reject the armor?
Tries in vain to go.
Yeah. So he tries it. I think this is something very, very blatant. So David tests assumptions before he dismisses them. He tests assumptions before he dismisses them. So rather, when you hear an assumption that you think might be ridiculous, be like David and test the assumption before you dismiss it immediately. This is something that I think that many of us could benefit from, because how many of you hear a recommendation and within half a second, that's ridiculous, won't work? I know, because I know, I have the experience, won't work, rather than sort of giving it the time of day. So what is the result under David's assumptions? What was that? Victory! Great, victory! Exactly. David has victory when he knows that God will rescue him. He has victory. God rescues David from those who he will defy over and over and over. In Luke chapter 18, verses 18 and 19, David Berceau bring this out in one of his books. He says, "Now a certain ruler asked him, saying, 'Good teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And then Jesus said to him, 'Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God.'" Do you see the parallels between David and what Jesus is saying here? So David has killed bears, killed lions, and he points to God for rescuing him. Jesus, a perfect man, someone calls him good. His first reaction is to point again to the good Father. We have a lot to learn from David. Many of us here in this room are very talented. I have had many discussions. I know you have sharp minds. I know you are athletic. I know you are successful in many ways. But when we receive a compliment, I pray we can be more like David and direct any of our successes straight to the Father and become very God-conscious as David was. And then back to the example about studying, we also need to prepare. Rather than taking the quick fixes, David was diligently preparing, diligently completing every task that he had before him with extreme success. All right, so what are some of the lessons that we can learn from this story, at least the way that I presented it? An obvious one is look at all the bad assumptions, avoid them. Look at all the good assumptions, make them. I hope that stands out as obvious. But going back to this example right here in the beginning, change the rules of your game by testing your assumptions. I don't know what your fake arm wrestling matches are going to look like in your life, but our adversaries here on earth are not the petty things that might bother us. They are the things that defy God. David tested the assumptions and recommendations before him. So maybe next time before you act on something or before you pursue a course of action, test your assumptions. Test yourself. Does this have anything to do with God? Am I angry right now because God is being defied? Or am I angry right now because I have some sort of pettiness that's entered into my life? The world around us is going to be telling us to pay attention to yourself. Pay attention to what makes you mad. Pay attention to your freedom, to your safety. If your safety is at risk, they're going to say, step back, wait for somebody else to step up. But rather than paying attention to these things, pay attention to God and develop this level of supreme God consciousness. I think we have an extreme danger right now in becoming free riders. I was talking to Professor Schumann the other day about this passage, and he pointed out to the motif in the story of David and Goliath that there's one victor and many spoils, where David goes and he conquers Goliath, and then the people behind him, they get to benefit from everything. And it's very similar to us in the New Testament era, in that Jesus is victor, and there are many spoils for us. But are there any dangers, do you think, in the Christian life about becoming free riders, about riding Jesus' victory without trying to make some of the harder decisions in life, about following some of the harder commands, about looking less like the world than we need to be? There are dangers about becoming bystanders. I think it's one of my biggest fears for our church, for the people of God, especially here in a comfortable city when our lives are pretty safe. Many of us live in abundance, that we can become bystanders in a world where there are many terrible things going on. So I would hope to call all of us, always challenge whether we're being a bystander or not when God is being defied. Are we doing everything we can to stand up and help when we need to be? The other interesting point, David met the defiers of God on their battlefield. He didn't invite Goliath back to Bethlehem. A lot of us, sometimes when we look at the state of the world, we see there are various fears, various people defying God, and there are various theories about how we as Christians should interact in these fears. Should we avoid them? Should we go in? Should we run away? Should we live in a bubble? One of the lessons I take from David is we train as shepherds, and we can win as warriors. We can enter into any sphere that we train for, we prepare for. So let's meet the defiers of God in our day and age on their battlefield without caving and without compromising. With the right perspective, I pray that we can have confidence that the God defiers will fall. Goliath will fall. Defend God's honor, point to his rescue instead of our strength, and then trust the process instead of the outcome. And now I want to revisit the 4 lessons that negotiators learned from this exercise. Many people assume that we live in a zero-sum world where other people benefiting detract from what we can gain. This is not necessarily true. It's not all about us. It's about God and his honor. Those who defy God in this day and age are still no match for the living God. And I pray that we can point to God and become faithful challengers, and that he would rescue us from those who bring dishonor to our day, to his name. One of my favorite examples about challenging this zero-sum game, how many of you ever had a field day growing up? Field day? All right. So there's this, I grew up with field day, and once a year you get together and you participate in all these different runs and sports events. And at the end of the day, you would get these ribbons, first, second, third place for all the events that you'd been in. And my friend and I, we looked at each other and we were like, I wonder what would happen if we tied. Like, do we get 2 first place ribbons? So sure enough, we made an agreement, we made a pact that we were going to tie in the 100-meter dash. And lo and behold, there weren't a fixed number of ribbons. Whoa, shocking. So in a short amount of time, we doubled the number of ribbons. Many of us come from different church backgrounds. Many of us come from different spiritual backgrounds, different traditional backgrounds. Always challenge the assumption that you're in a zero-sum game whenever you have a disagreement with a church background. I want to be part of a church that views people from different backgrounds, my own background, and say, can we be on the same team? Are we in a fixed-sum game, or can we stand on where we agree and build towards the kingdom and build towards the truth without compromising? So let's not assume we're in this zero-sum game. Classically, we tend to approach everybody as adversaries. And I hope after viewing this story, you would not view any man as your adversary, but rather people who defy the living God. So just as a reminder, we are in the new covenant. We are not in the old covenant. We don't live in this world where we can't even convert others to our own position rather than strike them with a stone on a forehead. I've said this many times, but let's not assume adversaries where we don't have to, but let's stand up and defend God's honor. Let's communicate very clearly with each other as we approach disagreements, and then let's fight for finding this optimal solution that Brother Malcolm and I adequately demonstrated here by doing all the things that we did. And as a final exhortation, be of good cheer, O people of God. With the right perspective, Goliath will fall. Amen.